All right, we are recording, and welcome to our next in our series of podcasts with authors of new books. And today we have Jen Christiansen, author of Building Science Graphics. Three
It looks
cheers for a book coming
wonderful.
out. It looks
Yeah,
amazing.
it
Welcome,
looks
Jen.
great.
Thank you. It's very exciting to have something to hold in my hands.
Yeah.
A physical thing at last after seeing it so many times on
Yeah.
the screen, right?
There's always that moment of joy. Digital files are never quite as real as an actual book.
They certainly aren't. Yeah. Well, thank you, Jen, for making the time.
Yeah.
Thanks for having this conversation. And thanks to both of you for being such great editors on this project. So I learned a lot about the process through your comments.
It was a lot of fun.
It was with the basic question, like, why did you write this book? Tell us.
Well, I give a lot of presentations and write blog posts and various things for different audiences, some of them being for scientists, others for journalists, on different parts of kind of the science graphics kind of process on how to build them and why. And so I've been thinking about these topics for a long time. And then Alberto, after a conversation between the two of you, apparently, Alberto reached out and asked if I had ever thought about writing a book. And I had, but it never seemed like quite the right time. And it always seemed like quite a large undertaking. But because I kind of kept getting the same kinds of questions from different people in presentations, it seemed to make sense to kind of just go ahead and jump in and try to pull this together into a resource that would be useful for folks.
Who usually asks those questions, and how does that relate to how you define science graphics? Were these scientists or designers or any other types?
Yeah, well, it's a little unusual in that I do talk to scientists and students, and then I also give presentations and talk with other designers and journalists. So I was getting slightly different questions from different angles, but a lot of them were on the same themes. From the scientists and students, things revolved a little bit more around some just basic design principles and conventions and wanting to learn how to get better at those and just to kind of build the confidence in part to just move forward with building their own graphics. And from journalists, the conversations that are swirling around in that area and with kind of the broader design world, not even just journalists, are things like visualizing complexity and uncertainty and misinformation. So those themes kind of popped up a lot in different places and different kinds of subgenres of the design world. So when a question pops up in a few different locations, you start to realize that that topic is sort of in the consciousness of a few different orbs, and so it might be worth putting down in writing.
Yeah, one thing I liked, I thought your book had a lot of useful and good definitions. I particularly liked your definition of information graphics as images built on a foundation of research that are constructed primarily to convey information. And that was just one of your many definitions. For example, what is your definition of science graphics more generally?
Well, so I often use graphics as shorthand for information graphics. And so kind of leaning on what you just stated, that they're images that are built on a foundation of research constructed to convey kind of a very specific bit of information. And then science graphics are just information graphics that are centered on scientific content. Now that chapter that kind of goes over a lot of definitions, some folks might say, it's just a lot of semantics, like just get right to the content. But it's funny to see how designers in our conversations with each other can get really hung up and almost, I don't want to say dismissive because it's more constructive than that. But I think sometimes we get hung up on the words that we're using to describe something. So I just kind of wanted to lay it out there for specialists and non-specialists, because I think then people who are outside of that world might be confused as to why are people like confused. Why are some designers dismissive about the term infographic? And others are totally fine with it. So I thought it would just make sense to, just lay it out. Here are some definitions that have been floating around for the last a decade or two or more. Here's how I'm using those terms in this book, and then kind of moving on from there.
I see the discussion about using terms such as infographics in a similar way. I see discussion about the term story. It's like we journalists use the term story for everything. It's like an interactive graphic is a story, a linear narrative is a story, a dashboard is a story. We call everything a story, so nothing is a story, right? So I think that some definitions, which I would not, I mean, the book doesn't present them as sort of like things that are written in stone. It's just your definitions, how you are going to refer to certain things in the book. I find that particularly useful because it saves you time later, right? If you define beforehand those terms, then you can use those terms without further explanation later in the book. So I found that compelling. I find that useful. I mean, some people may complain about being perhaps a little bit too academic or something. That's a complaint that we authors sometimes get, right? But I don't think that it is merited, right?
Yeah, and I try to make it clear that a lot of these definitions are very slippery, as you note, and so that just kind of to let people know, you might be hearing people use this with slightly different connotations in different settings, and that's like, that's totally fine, but to kind of give folks a background in how different people use the terms. Yeah.
And I particularly liked you had this page where you talked about these different continua from figurative to abstract, and then that your focus in particular was on these illustrated explanatory diagrams, and then you had this lovely full page spread about what was going on in this bigger picture. So the hallmark of your book is such a nice combination of precision and concrete examples for everything. So that, I mean, I do love the abstract, and I'm abstract all the time, but the concrete examples were super, super helpful.
Oh, thanks so much. And that continuum, I think, is really useful when I'm, because I talk a lot with scientific illustrators who tend to do focus on things like specimen illustrations, and data visualizers who work in kind of more abstract language. They're using the position of dots or lines on a page to convey information. And sometimes I think those two worlds kind of are off in their own like spaces, having conversations with each other. But it's like, no, these things are related. And that area in the middle that kind of might use a data visualization and a realistic illustration of something in the same graphic. Yeah, so it might be one way that those two things come together, but there's also ways that each of those communities can learn from each other, things that they can learn from each other, that's rooted in just different ways of approaching visuals, I think.
Something,
and while we're
sorry about that. No, I was about to say that something that you said, Tamara, the sort of like the combination between the discussion about concepts and the illustration of those concepts, right? Through the presentation of specific examples. That's something that we discussed quite a lot during the editing process, if I remember well, because it's something that I've done myself, right? It's like you sort of like write about these big concepts, big ideas, whatever, but then if you don't show people what they actually look like in real life, it's a little bit difficult to put them in practice, right? And I think that the book does that really, really well at the end, really well.
I was just going to say, while we were still talking about definitions, the other one I particularly enjoyed, which just helped me shift a teeny tiny bit my thinking of it, was your definition of science communication as the social conversation around science. I found that a really good guide to thinking.
Yeah, and I can't take credit for coming up with that concept. I use this book in part as an excuse to really dive into the literature and kind of get a few concepts kind of straight in my own head. And when really kind of diving into the literature on science communication, it became clear that that's one of the big kind of waves. It used to be kind of a more kind of unidirectional way of communicating, like an institution to people. And now it's being embraced much more as like, we need to be having a conversation. This is a back and forth with multiple players. So just ways of thinking about science communication and how that can then inform how you build a graphic and get you to thinking, why are you creating that graphic, and who is it for? And all of those things are sort of bolstered and by that idea of like, how does this fit into this larger conversation?
And you had all of these fantastic both references and direct explanations of all this work that I didn't know at all. Like you talked about the deficit model of unidirectionally providing information. So I'm like, now I can look this up. And you had a lot of really nice references to sort of beyond Western thinking and beyond Bauhaus thinking, like Saint Martin as an alternative to Bertin, which I'd never seen before. So I am very excited to dive into this treasure trove of existing references. And then you also pointed to a bunch of the books in our own series, both existing and forthcoming, like the existing data-driven storytelling and data sketches, and also Lisa Charlotte Roth's upcoming book on color. So this was just this like treasure trove of so many references.
Yeah, I used to, and I still do, sort of maintain a Google sheet of just references that I find useful over time. And that's what I used to give to scientists. I would give them this URL, this link, and to other folks, not just scientists, but I would give that to them when somebody would say, you know, how do I think about color, or how do I think about science communication? So this book was kind of a way to pull together a lot of those ideas, but then also to create more to explore sections with each
because
chapter.
these great little more to explore sections at the end where, you know, you say all these things in the chapter and then you're like, and here's how you can keep going. I always find those kinds of annotated bibliographies at the end of each chapter very useful for that launching point. You know, the hard part about literature searches is always, where do you start? Getting the right seeds. So
yeah, and
super
so
helpful.
I'm also trying to, you know, like every author, I think once you send in your final manuscript, you kind of hold your breath and you think, what if the definitive paper on X, Y, or Z now gets published before my book even becomes, you know, something in people's hands? So I have that fear a little bit, but one way
second edition, that's what the second
yeah.
edition's for.
Right. Well, another way I've been kind of calming that fear is I do on buildingsciencegraphics.com have a more to explore page where I have live links to these more to explore ones that appear in the book, but also new references and resources that I come across that didn't make the deadline for the final manuscript. That'll be kind of a living document, so folks can go there and see more.
Any book is a link in a chain of conversation. That's what books are. And whether you want to do a second edition of the book or not, that will be completely up to you. I know, for example, that myself will never make a second edition of any of my books, because when a book is done, it's done. I have nothing else to say. If there are more things to say about that topic, better people will take care of that. I can move on to other things, but I can see this book as a book that can benefit from that that existing live document somehow. Because I see this book as being adopted in science communication courses that want to become a little bit more visual than they are at the moment. We teach science communication at the University of Miami, for example, but it is taught in a very textual manner, right? It barely touches upon visualization or infographics. The students who are interested in that take my class, but they don't learn that in the science communication class. Well, what about if we sort of like we try to create this multimedia experience in the teaching of science communication, and we incorporate a book like this? That would be my own proposal for a course like that.
Yeah, I mean, so much science communication and journalism training focuses on written and oral presentations. I mean, I think that is changing, especially in journalism programs, but not necessarily in science communication programs, especially science training or communication training for scientists. But images kind of have a much lower barrier of entry, right? I mean, like color, form, composition, that all can kind of trigger a reaction from a viewer without kind of significant conscious effort as pulling somebody in anyway. And then, but you can say that about all images, but science graphics are uniquely positioned to kind of act as visual aids to both beckon folks in and to inform that conversation that we were talking about earlier. So they're kind of a welcoming gesture to get somebody into a topic, and then provides them with some kind of concrete information and evidence and conclusions that can kind of help inform the conversations that follow. So I think that's kind of where this visual and the conversation of science communication kind of come together. Yeah.
And I think you've just exactly answered what I was going to ask as my next question, which is why are science graphics useful in telling stories about science? I think you've already said it in a nutshell.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, it's tempting to say that imagery is a universal language, which is not. I mean, there's visual jargon is just as prevalent as written jargon. But just in terms of being something that you get the immediate gist from, or you get a tone, or you get kind of, like I said before, that welcoming gesture in, and then you can learn a lot more information from there.
So maybe this is a good starting point for my next question, which is, you've got this whole chapter called Special Considerations for Science Graphics. So why do science graphics merit special considerations? What makes them different than a graphic that's not focused on science?
Yeah, and this is where I'm hoping the sections that'll be most informative for journalists and designers who may feel like, okay, well, I understand kind of the basic conventions of design, so why do I need this book? But science graphics are a little bit of an odd beast. I mean, they're beholden to those same design conventions in terms of just how to guide kind of a reader's attention through an image in a clear manner. But the content they convey is rooted in a process that a lot of people don't necessarily know a lot about. They just hear, science says this. Well, what is that weird science kind of orb? How does that get populated with this information that gets pointed to? So the information that you're presenting in a science graphic is rooted in evidence, but interpretations might shift as additional evidence is analyzed. It's kind of this incremental process, and it's important to honor that in graphics. So I think there's a great chapter in the Night Science Journalism's book called Science Editing Handbook. It's a free online resource if you just look up KSJ Science Editing Handbook. In it, there's a chapter written by journalist Apurva Mandavili that kind of really talks about that incremental and slow nature, and that journalists and others who are reporting on science need to understand that your audience may not understand why this one little step is an important step in this bigger picture, and that there will be another step after that. So these aren't all necessarily very static ideas. There might be some shifting. So science topics are really complex, and they're kind of, it's showing something that's part of a bigger process. So to that end, I find it really useful, and I think Alberto, you've talked about this a lot before, or written about it, the idea of clarifying the information as opposed to simplifying the information. So I think kind of approaching science graphics with that mindset, where you're clarifying something, really kind of opens you up into trying to help a reader understand, where this falls in the bigger picture, and to kind of really dive into all the intricacies and not try to oversimplify it.
I always add here sort of like a proper note about attribution, that quote is not even mine. That comes from another one of our authors, Nigel Holmes. So I stole that from Nigel. I didn't steal it, obviously, but I always quote Nigel. But I got that from a talk that Nigel gave. I think that it was at the Malofie conference many years ago. That it got stuck in my mind. I said, this is such a great description of what we are trying to do. We are not trying to simplify things. We are trying to clarify them. Sometimes that involves information reduction, but sometimes it involves increasing the amount of information that you show, because otherwise you may be oversimplifying, and an oversimplification is never a good clarification of the information at hand. Can we talk a little bit about go ahead. There's a little
I'm
bit
just glad you mentioned. I'm glad you mentioned Nigel's name. I name check him in the book as well. But yeah, he has a lovely way of doing that in a really kind of yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about the cover?
Yes. So it was funny because my family and friends have told me before, well, I mean, you're a designer. Why didn't you design the illustration on your own cover? And I was like, well, it's different things. I do science graphics. I don't do cover art. So I hired Ali Torban, because I had seen some of her other work, and I knew she lives in this data visualization world and this editorial kind of world where cover art was kind of in her wheelhouse as well. And it was such a treat to just have conversation with her about what the goals of the book are, who the audience is. Her process is really, really thorough and enjoyable. And so it was a real treat to have her work on the art for this cover.
Yeah, and it worked so well, this sort of the constituent elements and the bringing together. And she's done a number of covers in her series. She did the one for Neil Richards, and I think she really has a knack for getting at an intent without being overly figurative about it, but sort of getting at the spirit of books. She does that quite nicely.
Yeah, and she really also tuned into the idea of, I don't want folks who read this book to worry about, the idea of I can't draw, therefore I can't create a graphic. It's like, no, this is about organizing shapes on a page. You can do that. It's just slowing down and thinking about how those shapes, what order they should appear in and how they should be in relative to one another. And so I loved how she kind of tapped into that idea with the cover.
And speaking of love, I love that you have another taxonomy. I admit I'm a not very closeted taxonomy fan. And you have this super interesting one in the chapter right after what's so special about science communications. You had these types of science graphics, and you talk about descriptive imagery versus process diagram, instructional guide, organizational chart, thought experiment, vignette, comparison, and then a summary multi-part graphic. And again, I love taxonomies because they help me think, and your taxonomy exactly did help me think about this part of the design space. So thank you for that.
Oh, thanks. I also like that taxonomies, although they can be limiting sometimes, they do provide kind of a shared language to talk to collaborators with. So you can say, I think this would be a good comparison diagram because our goal here is to compare these two states. So it kind of creates a way of talking about different kinds of graphics.
Taxonomies are shortcuts and heuristics in some sense. As long as we don't reify them, as long as we don't put them in a pedestal and think that they are the end of the discussion, they are very useful tools. But to get the conversation started, because once you start applying them, you start seeing, as you said before, that and you mentioned in the book that everything in this craft works or operates in a continuum, right? It is not. There are no binaries here. There are no boundaries here. It's like everything merges and intertwines with everything else. And I guess that I'm a much more chaotic thinker than you both are. I couldn't care less about taxonomies, but this is very useful. I mean, even if I don't care that much about them, when I read it, I had the same reaction as you did, Tamara.
And then you've got this section, like all of part 3 is like, how do you do it yourself? And so tell us in a nutshell, what is your process for building a graphic?
Well, the first kind of big step is to establish the goal of the graphic. And I think too many people just kind of start to dive right in and start putting shapes on pages, and they don't stop and think, first of all, what's the content here? What's the point of this graphic? What information will it hold or should it hold? And to think about the context. So who's the audience and what is the outlet? So if you force yourself to sort of articulate a goal of the graphic in a few sentences that address both of those points very kind of broadly, it doesn't need to be, completely pinned down, but at least to help kind of get you moving forward. That kind of creates this touchstone that you can use when talking with collaborators to say, hey, this is the kind of graphic I'm thinking of creating. Does this work within this full story? And then it also can help guide your design decisions. So, but then once you have that goal and you kind of continue doing content research, then moving forward, I like to break things down into kind of 3 benchmarks. So you have a concept sketch, a tight sketch, and final art. And so that after each of those benchmarks, you work with your collaborators to have them provide feedback, ask specific questions related to what kind of feedback you're hoping for at each stage. For example, at the concept sketch stage, I'm most interested in making sure that I'm getting the big picture right. So I would ask collaborators if the information and the path through that information is useful, clear, and accurate. I wouldn't be asking about color palette issues or aesthetics at that stage, or style. It's mostly about, is this adhering to this goal that we agreed upon earlier. But mostly I think it's just getting folks to walk through a process one step at a time, and to realize that these don't just kind of emerge fully formed all in one go. It's definitely an iterative process. And doing the 3 stages kind of puts in some boundaries on it, so it doesn't just spiral on forever.
And I loved in your book, right, you have these progressions. You have a bunch of case studies of actually showing us examples of how you go from, sketches to better sketches to, things like the complete version. And you have it not just once, but you have many. You have in your own work, you have the work of a bunch of other people that you showcase. I really love these progressions so we can see how it develops over these stages. I found that super useful.
And part of that was also prompted by seeing data sketches and Naughty Bremer and Shirley Wu's great series of showing the process one step at a time for many different examples, to show that it's not the same path every time, and it's not the same path for one person and another, but there is a path that takes steps. So I really appreciated reading that in their book too.
So do you have any top tips for folks who are completely new to this? Like how should they start thinking? You've told them about your process. What are the top things for them to think about?
Well, first one is to remember it's a process, but then also just start out with lots of fast, kind of low risk doodles. Just create small boxes on loose leaf paper with a pencil that approximate the size or the kind of the general aspect ratio of your graphic, and just experiment very quickly without thinking too much about it, of a bunch of different ways of organizing the information on that page. It kind of acts as a warm-up, but it also keeps you from being too precious about any one solution. And the minute you start to really kind of become precious about a solution, I think you kind of cut yourself off from the iterative process. So just kind of this doodling stage, I think, is really important. Let's see, other tips. Just honor your audience and honor your outlet. So think about who you're doing the graphic for and where it'll appear. Like if you're doing a graphic for a poster session, it's going to be very different than a graphic that appears in a print journal. But I think a lot of people use that same graphic for both cases. A journalist wouldn't use the exact same graphic for a print broad page, newspaper, and then a mobile phone. They have to think about, how do I take this information and present it in different ways for these different outlets. So I think just getting in the mindset of thinking about, where is this going to live and who is it for?
Yeah, design always depends on constraints, right? And the constraints may be the platform where the graphic is shown, the prior knowledge that the audience may have about the topic at hand. And sometimes we don't consider any of those, and we fail completely at designing the graphic.
It's also one of my favorite things about being a designer is to figure out what you can do within constraints.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge, and that's the kind of the fun part. It's like not saying, oh, well, I only have this much space, I can't possibly work. It's like, oh, I only have this much space, how can I make it work? That's kind of fun.
Talking about process, one of my favorite parts was, because I have done this myself, I've taught design classes for scientists, and one of my pet peeves is the design of academic posters for conferences. And you have an example of those, like a before and an after, in which you cleaned it up and show. Very simple, very straightforward. One of the things that I have found when teaching people things such as, for example, don't overuse boxes. because people tend to box everything out, put everything inside boxes, like in your original example. And once you show them what the design looks like without the boxes, mainly using just negative space to separate the sections, it's like something clicks. I say, oh, why didn't I think about that? It's so obvious, right? But you need to see it, right? In order to understand it. That's why these examples are so crucial to the success of a book like these.
And if I recall, you nudged me into including more of those in the editing
Oh,
process, which I'm grateful.
I remember myself saying that, more, show me more. I don't understand what these mean. I mean, I understood what you meant, obviously, but I had the feeling that people could benefit from seeing it applied somehow. Yeah.
Well, and I often resist the idea of doing makeover examples because they often start with somebody else's work, and you have no idea what the constraints were.
Yeah.
And so, so I always kind of shy away from that. So it's just a matter of you nudging me to say, well, make some of your own then. You've seen common examples of how, folks who may not be familiar with some design principles or conventions, like what the work might look like. And then so just create a before and then show an after.
Create your own bad graphics and then make them better, applying sort of like the non-principles that people have applied to those designs. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And there's another section I quite liked in the book. You have this whole chapter on collaborations and particularly critiquing critiques. How is it that you can actually both open yourself to receive feedback more and help people give you useful feedback? And so that subsection on constructive critiques I thought was particularly good for folks that don't have the kind of designer or art school training on critiques, because most scientists and engineers do not have a class in which critique was a method of discourse. They just literally don't know that's a thing. So I thought this was a really nice summary of it.
Yeah, it's really striking when you're in a critique and you start to realize who's had art classes where this is just one of the things you do. You publicly talk about each other's work on the fly, as it's on a wall in front of you, and that there's certain best practices, there's certain courtesies, there's certain way of doing that in a constructive manner, and you forget that that's a learned skill and something that takes practice to give and to receive, and so it's kind of striking when you're suddenly put in a position where there's people from different disciplines and it becomes clear that not everybody is kind of familiar with that practice
or comfortable with it. There are people who are uncomfortable in that. I've found students, for example, who are a little bit wary, but I always say the same thing. I say this is what you're going to experience in the real world, whether it's a collaborator talking with you about what you have just designed, or readers themselves reacting to what you have designed and sending you angry emails about your graphics, right? So you better get used to it. You better get the constructive criticism before you get the destructive criticism that you sometimes, unfortunately, may get.
Yeah, and you get better with receiving both positive and negative feedback with practice. So it's just a practice thing too.
Yeah. Anyway, Jen, congratulations on the book again. It looks great.
Thank you.
Yes, many congratulations. It is fantastic.
Thanks to both of you for nudging it into being. I really appreciate it.
You need to do a follow-up at some point. Second part.
No, bask in the glory of having finished. All right. Thanks so much for the interview.
Thank you.
Thank
both.
you.
Thank you. See you.
Thanks.